Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we will start talking about labor, which is called parturition in physiology, as well as lactation. These subjects are covered in your textbook Guyton and Hall in chapter 83. By the end of this lecture, you are expected to probably appreciate more your mom and what she has gone through to bring you to life. Also, you will be able to recognize hormonal factors that induce labor or parturition, to describe the role of oxytocin hormone in the contracting the uterus during labor, also describe labor mechanics, and recognize physiology behind lactation. In the ideal situation, a pregnant woman at the end of her pregnancy, after 40 weeks of pregnancy, if counted from the last menstrual period, childbirth or labor will start by its own, and it is called parturition. So parturition means the birth of the baby, okay, or in other terms, labor or delivery of baby. So when the uterus becomes progressively very or highly excitable, it will develop a highly and strong rhythmical contractions. Then the baby is going to be expelled. This process is called parturition. The exact cause of this increased activity of the uterus is not completely known, but at least there are two main reasons to have parturition started. First, there are progressive hormonal changes that cause the increased excitability of the uterine muscles, and second, there are progressive mechanical changes that take place in the uterus by the end of pregnancy. Of the hormonal factors that increase uterine contractility is first the increased ratio of estrogens to progesterone. It is thought that increased estrogen level, a little bit more than progesterone, will actually induce contraction of the uterus. As it's known that progesterone inhibits the uterine contractility, however, estrogens increase the degree of uterine contractility. So when progesterone increases a little bit more than estrogen, that means there will be more susceptibility to contraction in the uterus than when the ratio is closer, or the levels of estrogen and progesterone are closer to each other. And it's known that estrogen increases the number of gap junctions between the smooth muscle cells of the uterus, and that actually induces or stimulates the transmission of contractions between the smooth muscle cells, and that also contributes to the susceptibility or to the probability of increasing uterine contraction by the end of pregnancy, when estrogen increases a little bit more than progesterone. And that's actually take place after the 7th month. Estrogen secretion increases while progesterone stays or remains constant, and that increases the ratio of estrogen to progesterone and may at the end initiate labor or parturition. The second and most important hormone causing contraction of the uterus is oxytocin. Oxytocin is a neuropeptide, which is a polypeptide secreted by the neurohypophysis, and specifically causes uterine contraction. There are 4 reasons that make oxytocin very important in increasing the contractility of the uterus near term. When we call term, it means finished the 40 weeks of gestation since the last menstrual cycle. So the uterine muscle increases the oxytocin receptors in the last few months of pregnancy, indicating the importance of oxytocin in labor. Second, the rate of oxytocin secretion by the neurohypophysis is increased at the time of labor, suggesting its importance in labor. And third, in hypophysiectomized animals, in experimental animals, they can still deliver their babies, but labor is prolonged to a long period of time. So that indicates also the importance of oxytocin. In animal experiments also, it has been shown that irritation of the cervix will cause a neurogenic reflex through the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus, which induces or stimulates the secretion of oxytocin. And this is another proof for the importance of oxytocin in the labor or in parturition process. Also, there are some effects of some of the fetal hormones on the uterus that are important in parturition. The fetus pituitary gland secretes high amounts of oxytocin, and also the fetus's adrenal gland secrete large quantities of corticosteroids or cortisol, which can be another possible uterine stimulant. Also, the membranes of the fetus release prostaglandins in high concentrations at the time of the labor, suggesting a role in inducing the intensity or increasing the intensity of uterine contractions. And prostaglandins sometimes are used in inducing labor or in labor induction as medications. Mechanical factors that increase uterine contractility are first the stretch of the uterine musculature. So simply by stretching the smooth muscles in the uterus increase their contractility. So with intermittent stretch that can occur repeatedly in the uterus due to the fetal movement can also increase the stimulation of smooth muscle contraction, especially at the end or the last weeks of pregnancy. It has been shown that in twins, an average of 19 days, the baby will be, or the babies are going to be born earlier than a single child. And that indicates the importance of mechanical stretch in stimulating the uterine contractions. So the increase in stretch due to twins or to 2 babies at a time will induce more or further the stretch and will elicit the labor earlier than when we have only a single baby. Second, it's not only the stretch of the uterine musculature, also a stretch of the cervix, and irritation of the cervix has been shown to be very important in stimulating or starting uterine contraction. So either stretching or irritating the uterine cervix has been shown to be important in eliciting uterine contractions and parturition. And a good example on that is that obstetricians frequently induce labor. If labor was not started by its own, they can induce that due to several reasons by rupturing the membranes, the fetal membranes, so that the head of the baby will exert more stretch on the cervix and irritates it, and then labor will start. either due to neural reflexes that travel from the cervix into the body of the uterus, or it could be only transmission of the mechanical or myogenic stretch from the cervix into the uterus. And it's not exactly known why does that happen, but it's very well proven that this actually happens. If you rotate or stretch the cervix, the labor will start very shortly, or in hours after that, or in a day or so. This is a link to a YouTube video that illustrates labor. It's very nice. I recommend you to watch this illustrative video on YouTube. Now, labor. Let's look at the events that take place during labor. The most driving force for labor has been thought to be a positive feedback mechanism, and this is the most accepted theory of labor. So during the months of pregnancy, the uterus will undergo periodic contractions, very weak and slow rhythmical contractions that are called Braxton-Hicks contractions. So these contractions actually become stronger and progressively stronger by the end of pregnancy. And then they start stretching the cervix, and they become more regular, more intense, and more frequent. And eventually they will cause or induce labor. So they will force the baby actually during the birth canal, causing parturition, which is the labor process. And these contractions then will be called labor contractions instead of Braxton-Hicks contractions. So the main accepted theory behind parturition is the positive feedback theory, which suggests that stretch of the cervix by the fetus head here will actually induce a positive loop to stimulate the uterus or uterine body, okay, contraction. So the stretch here in the cervix will make a positive loop by either just an automatic response of the smooth muscle cells in the uterus wall, or by initiating neural or nerve impulses that are transmitted into the brain and that stimulates the secretion of the hormone oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland. Then oxytocin is going to be carried in the bloodstream into the uterus back to stimulate the uterine contractions to push the baby toward the cervix. So in this positive feedback loop, we have seen that the increase in contractility of the body will push the baby forward, which will stretch the cervix more and even initiates a more positive feedback to the uterus. So this process is continued until labor is finished. Actually, labor contractions obey all the principles of positive feedback. That's why this theory is the most accepted theory of labor. Until now, we mentioned two types of positive feedback loops during labor. The first one is that the stretch of the cervix causes the entire body of the uterus to contract, as we mentioned. So it is direct relationship between the cervix rotation and stretch and the body of the uterus. The second loop is the cervical stretching will cause a neural reflex that will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. And here oxytocin stimulation or secretion stimulation will induce further uterine contractility, and contractility will induce more release of oxytocin as a reflex, and that's also another potent positive feedback stimulation. As you can see here in the body of the uterus, there are strong waves of contraction. However, in the cervix, there will be weak contractions to allow more space for the baby to be expelled out of the uterus. Now, also the abdominal muscles play a role in labor in terms that the pain signals that originate from the uterus and from the birth canal, in addition to being very painful and cause suffering to the woman in labor, also, they elicit neurogenic reflexes in the spinal cord to the abdominal muscles. These reflexes will cause intense contractions of the abdominal muscles, helping or working along with the uterine contractions toward expulsion of the baby. So they are very helpful in inducing or stimulating the delivery of the baby. In the early phase of labor, the uterine contractions become, as we mentioned, very regular and very close to each other and stronger. So the expecting woman is usually advised to follow the rule of 4-1-2 in order to know when she is in labor and when she should go to the hospital. That means that when the labor or the contractions of the uterus, when they are 4 minutes, about 4 minutes apart, and if they last for 1 minute, and that occurs in a regular rhythm for at least 2 hours, then the woman is advised to go to the hospital and she is in labor. So as labor progresses, the contractions become stronger and even closer. The intensity also increased greatly with very short period of relaxation between contractions. And that actually continues and the combination of uterus as well as abdominal muscles contraction will facilitate the delivery of the baby. It will cause a downward force of the fetus of about 25 pounds during each strong contraction. And these contractions are characterized by being intermittent. And the physiological relevance of being intermittent is that the strong contractions actually stop the blood flow through the placenta, which is very important for the life of the fetus. And if they continued for not intermittent periods, for continuous contractions, that would cause the death of the fetus because it will cut off the oxygen of the fetus. So that's why they are characterized by being intermittent. And it is very important to be cautious when a uterine stimulant is used, such as Pitocin or the oxytocin medications that can be given to stimulate or induce labor, which can cause, if they were in very high amounts or frequency, they can cause uterine spasm that can lead to death of the fetus due to the, of course, the shortage or the lack of supply of the oxygen or hypoxia in the fetus. Actually, in more than 95% of births, the head usually is directed in the actually facing the vaginal or the birth canal. But in some of the pregnancies, the buttocks and or the feet are presented first, which is called the breech presentation, which is very hard to induce labor or to have a normal labor with this position. And actually, toward the end of pregnancy, the cervix becomes very soft, and that will allow it to stretch with the labor contractions that begun in the uterus. And now we will talk about the stages of labor in very general details. So the first stage of labor is when there is a progressive cervical dilatation or dilation. So the first stage of labor is the dilation and effacement, and the effacement is when the in the opening of the cervix is approximately the same size of the head of the fetus, and that's when they call it complete effacement. It may last for 8 to 24 hours, this stage. And usually for the multiple pregnancies, the woman who had multiple pregnancies or multiple deliveries, this stage will not last for too long, maybe for a few minutes. After that, the fetal membranes will rupture and the amniotic fluid might be lost, okay, through the vagina. And then after that, the second stage of labor will start when the head of the fetus moves rapidly through the birth canal. So at this stage, as you can see here in this figure, is stage 2, when the head is moving across the birth canal, and of course with additional forces from above, it will continue wedging the way through the canal until complete or delivery is completed. And this process may last from 1 minute into 30 minutes. And there is a demonstrative or illustrative video here that you can follow to look at these stages in a very nice and detailed illustrations. After delivery of the child, about 10 to 45 minutes after birth of the baby, the uterus will continue in contraction and will get smaller and smaller in size, and that will cause a shearing force that will separate the placenta from its implantation site. And this separation actually will open up the placental sinuses, and this will cause bleeding that will not last for a long time. This bleeding is only 350 mils. The mechanism of stopping bleeding is that the smooth muscle fibers in the uterine muscle are arranged so that they are surrounding the blood vessels as figure 8 around the blood vessels. And when the uterine muscle contracts, they will actually block the blood vessels and stop bleeding right away. Also, there is another evidence suggests that vasoconstrictor prostaglandins that are formed at the placental separation site will also help to make additional vascular spasm that will also help in stopping bleeding. Now, in early labor, pain of labor is actually due to hypoxia, mainly of the uterine muscle, that results from compression of the blood vessels in the uterus. And that actually is transmitted via the visceral sensory hypogastric nerve, which carries the visceral sensory signals from the uterus. But during the second stage of labor, there will be much more severe pain that is due to the cervical stretching, to sometimes perineal stretching or tearing, and structures of the vaginal canal tearing itself. So this pain is actually conducted to the mother's spinal cord and the brain by somatic nerves instead of the visceral sensory nerves. Right after delivery or labor, the uterus will actually involute, and the placental site on the endometrial surface will autolyse, causing a vaginal discharge that is known as lochia. The lochia actually is it's going to be first bloody and then serous in nature, and will continue being secreted for a total of 10 days and sometimes to up to 40 days. And that's what is called the postpartum bleeding. After this time, the endometrial surface will re-epithelialize to begin a new female cycles after that. Lactation is actually a very important process that enables the mom to feed her baby during his 4 to 6 months of life. The hormones that are responsible for lactation process are the estrogens, the progesterone, and other hormones such as prolactin, the adrenal glucocorticoids, and the insulin, which we will talk about their role, each one of those. As you can see here on the right, the breast structures that enable lactation are the lobes that contain lobules, and these lobules contain structures that are secretory glands called alveoli. The alveoli, as you can see here in the bottom figure, are modified sweat glands that are milk-producing epithelial cells that are also surrounded by myoepithelial cells, which helps to expel the milk outside of the alveoli through the ductal system, which is called the lactoferous duct, which carries milk from the glands, from the milk glands out of the breast. So the importance of hormones: estrogen stimulates the growth of the ductal system of the breasts. Progesterone is extremely important for the full development of the lobule alveolar system, which makes these organs milk secreting organs. And actually, both estrogen and progesterone act synergistically in order to make these functional milk secreting organs. Other important hormones are the growth hormone prolactin and the adrenal glucocorticoids and the insulin, which play an important role in protein metabolism that is necessary for the lactation process. Prolactin indeed is the primary hormone that promotes lactation, or the actual production of milk. It's a hormone that is secreted by the mother's anterior pituitary gland. The concentration of prolactin rises steadily from the 5th week of pregnancy, so in the last trimester before the birth of the baby. And the level is going to be about 10 to 20 times the normal non-pregnant woman. So as we can see here on the figure, prolactin level before parturition, as you can see here, the red curve, and the red curve, prolactin is increasing just parallel to estrogen and progesterone in the last semester. And even with this high level of prolactin, there won't be production of milk that is significant. It's thought that both progesterone and estrogen has suppressive effects on prolactin, so that only few milliliters of fluid can be secreted before the birth of the baby due to the high level of prolactin. Secretions of milk in the last few days before delivery and the first few days after delivery or parturition is called colostrum. And colostrum has the same concentration of proteins and lactose in milk, but it has low or no fat. The maximum rate of excretion is 1/100 of the subsequent rate of milk production. So the sudden loss of inhibition by estrogen and progesterone after the placenta separation and will actually allow the prolactin to have its lactogenic effects. So it will assume the natural promotion of milk production. So between 1 to 7 days after delivery, milk is going to be produced instead of the colostrum, the liquid that we talked about that can be secreted before delivery or the first few days after delivery. Colostrum actually is characterized by having low fat and also by being rich in the immunoglobulins and in the immune cells. There is a requirement for adequate background secretion of growth hormone, cortisol, parathyroid hormone, as well as insulin for a normal lactation process. These hormones provide necessary amino acids, fatty acids, glucose, and calcium to produce that are important as components of the milk. The basal levels of prolactin after birth will return to the non-pregnant level, as you can see here on the figure on the right. After parturition, you'll see a decline of the level of prolactin, but you also will see surges of prolactin that are intermittent. So there will be fluctuations in the prolactin levels. And what's the reason behind that is that there will be nervous signals that will travel from the nipples into the hypothalamus that will induce a prolactin surge, which is 10 to 20-fold increase in the level of prolactin whenever the baby suckles the breast of the mother while nursing. So that's what caused the fluctuations in prolactin level during nursing. What's the importance of these surges, prolactin surges? It keeps the mammary glands working, secreting milk for the next or subsequent nursing period. So it stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk for the subsequent nursing session. There is an important regulatory control mechanism by the hypothalamus for lactation. Hypothalamus is very well known to induce or increase the release. So it induces releasing hormone for so many, as we know, so many hormones in the pituitary gland. So it secretes releasing hormone usually. But at this time, for prolactin, hypothalamus secretes prolactin inhibitory hormone. So this is actually the opposite of what we know about the hypothalamic releasing hormone. This hormone is actually inhibitor hormone for prolactin. That was evidenced when we remove the hypothalamus, if there is damage to the hypothalamus, or if we block the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, so we prevent secretions coming from the hypothalamus into the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. There will be increase in the prolactin secretion. So that means the hypothalamic or the hypothalamus have an inhibitory role in regulating prolactin secretion. So when we remove that effect, it's going to be stimulated or increased. However, the other anterior pituitary hormones are going to be depressed if we remove the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system or the hypothalamus. So that means prolactin is inhibited by a factor that is transported through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system that is will come to the anterior pituitary gland and prevent the stimulation or secretion of prolactin. And that factor actually was proven to be the same as the catecholamine dopamine. And dopamine is known to be secreted by the arcuate nuclei of the hypothalamus and have the ability to decrease prolactin secretion by tenfold. A very important outcome of nursing is that in most nursing mothers, the ovarian cycle and ovulation will be suppressed and it will not resume until a few weeks after cessation of nursing or after nursing gets less frequent and less regular. And that's when actually the baby starts eating solid foods. So nursing will be less and then ovulation and ovarian cycle might start again. The same nervous signal from the breast to the hypothalamus that can cause prolactin secretion, which occur during suckling due to the nervous signals or because of a subsequent effect of the prolactin that will inhibit the secretion of gonadotropin releasing hormone by the hypothalamus, which will actually prevent stimulation of FSH and LH. So this inhibition of gonadotropin releasing hormone will cause an inhibition of the secretion of LH and FSH, and so the ovarian cycle will be not working while nursing or having an active nursing. But several months after lactation, and actually it is different between mothers, and especially the ones who not frequently nurse their baby, then the pituitary gland will start secreting sufficient LH and FSH to restart the monthly female sexual cycles, just as in the non-pregnant women. Lactation also process rely on another hormone that causes the ejection or the let down process of the milk, which is oxytocin. So milk does not flow easily from the alveoli into the ductal system just by the influence of prolactin. Milk must be ejected from the alveoli into the ducts before the baby can obtain that milk. And the process of that, it is the ejection that is induced by oxytocin that will cause the let down or the milk ejection from the breasts. The process or mechanism behind that is a combination of neurogenic and hormonal reflexes that involves the posterior pituitary hormone oxytocin. So here again, oxytocin is important not only for delivery of the baby and labor, it's also important for starting lactation or ejecting milk from the breast. So when the baby suckles the breast, it will receive no milk for the first half minute. Then sensory impulses will travel through somatic sensory nerves to the mother's spinal cord and then will go to the hypothalamus, where they cause nerve signals that signal secretion of oxytocin at the same time that they cause prolactin secretion. So when oxytocin is released to the blood, then the in the breast, it will causes the myoepithelial cells to contract. And as we mentioned before, the myoepithelial cells surround the outer walls of the alveoli. So when they contract, they will be expressing milk from the alveoli, and milk will be expelled out of the ducts at a pressure of about 10 to 20 millimeter mercury. Then the baby's suckling becomes more effective after the first minutes in removing milk. So within the first 30 seconds to 1 minute after the baby begins suckling, then milk will flow faster and faster and better. And this process is called milk ejection or milk let down, which is regulated or started by the hormone oxytocin. Let's look at the milk composition. Milk is produced about 1.5 liters a day, each day. Of course, there are variabilities between the nursing females, and also if the babies were more than one baby. So there is high energy actually drained from the mother, approximately 650 to 750 kilocalorie per liter of milk produced will be consumed. Very large metabolic substrates are lost from the mother. So as you can see here in this table, the constituents of milk, about 88% is water, then 3% is fat. There is about 50 grams per day of are lost from the mother while nursing. Also, there is lactose lost about 100 grams per day, which constitutes about 6% of the milk. The enzyme casein, lactoalbumin, other proteins, as well as the ash, which is minerals, calcium, and other minerals. There is also a loss of 2 to 3 grams of calcium phosphate lost daily from the mother, from the nursing mother. So the diet of the mom should contain high amounts of milk and should be rich in calcium and vitamin D to supply the needed calcium and phosphate to the fetus. Actually, if the diet was lacking the calcium or vitamin D, the parathyroid glands of the woman actually enlarges and secretes parathyroid hormone, which decalcify the bones of the nursing woman. Actually, this process, decalcification, can also occur during pregnancy, but it's not gonna make a big problem during pregnancy, but it can be very harmful for the lactating female because it will be to a larger extent than during pregnancy, because you know the demands of the baby needs more calcium during the growth in the first months of life. There are also multiple types of antibodies and other anti-infectious agents that are secreted in the milk along with the other nutrients. Milk of the mother is very rich in white blood cells such as neutrophils and macrophages. These are very important and helpful to fight against bacteria that can cause very or highly deadly infections, such as the E. coli that can cause a very deadly and lethal diarrhea in the newborn. With this, we come to the end of this chapter of pregnancy, parturition, and lactation. And in next lecture, we will start with the neonatal and fetal physiology. We will discuss the physiological changes that take place with the fetus just after delivery. I also would like to ask you to be more interactive, to post your questions, to ask questions, and on e-learning on the forum that is actually put there for physiology lectures. So please study these topics regularly أول بأول, and don't accumulate the materials until the time of the quiz. and good luck.